Just before the service started tonight, I told a friend that I was going to be speaking on my favorite topic. And he said, "Oh, what, on honesty?" I mean, no. And then when we were in the chapel earlier, Bill told the band that I was going to be speaking on humility. So I'm thinking that maybe I'm the only one that didn't get the memo, because I'm not talking about humility either. So I'm going to tell you in a couple of minutes what I am going to be talking about, but it's not honesty or humility. Not that they're not good topics, but they're just not for tonight. So last week I spoke about how thinking negative thoughts about ourselves and having basic personal assumptions like, I'm not good enough, I'm a loser, I'm worthless, those thoughts, those basic personal assumptions aren't consistent with the way God sees us. So therefore, I see them as a shortcoming that we need to work on asking God to have us to remove. And July, or whenever you're working your step 7, is a good time to do that. This week, I want to explore how not being in touch with our feelings or medicating them away, or in cases where we can't get in touch with them and not trying to find a solution to that problem, could also be considered a shortcoming and something else to work on. Our scripture is from Proverbs chapter 4, verse 23. Just one line of scripture tonight. And it says, "Guard your heart above all else, for it determines the course of your life." When I read this scripture, I thought about how important that is on so many levels. The first level, and the one most often thought of, would be from a romantic standpoint. Most of us would be inclined to think that way. Be careful not to give your heart away to someone who doesn't deserve it, because you may get hurt. And many of us have experienced the heartache of lost loves and relationships gone bad. When I read this, guard your heart above all else, for it determines the course of your life, I thought of it on an entirely different level. Not to say that the first one isn't important, and it does relate to what I'm going to talk about, but I think there is so much more in that short proverb than meets the eye. King Solomon, who wrote that line, was a wise man, certainly one of the wisest of his day. And knowing that, I wondered if he was thinking about more than just affairs of the heart in a romantic sense. And I'm going to say yes. So tonight, we're going to talk about the F word. It's a word that most of us know. That's right. We're going to talk about feelings. And tonight I'm going to do things a little bit differently. I don't have a 20-minute message prepared. I'm going to talk from my heart about my favorite topic, feelings. Now, any counselor or therapist worth their salt is going to tell you that the heart is the seat of all our feelings. The nice thing about the heart is that it has an infinite capacity for feelings. The more you feel, the more capacity you have for feeling. When we examine the scripture, King Solomon says, it determines the course of your life. And those are strong words, and I believe them. Anybody who has worked with me in treatment or in counseling knows just how much I believe them. Right? In fact, I believe this so much that when I met my beautiful bride-to-be, Barbara, I told her that if she wasn't willing to discuss her feelings, then that was a deal breaker for me. So we have 3 deal breakers: infidelity, not talking about feelings, and squeezing the toothpaste tube in the middle. I'm inclined to throw in a 4th one because she also has the toilet paper come off the bottom of the roll, which is just wrong. Everybody knows that. Get a roadblock here. There we go. So I'm going to talk about 18 inches. 18 inches we've talked about a lot here in the church, and it's approximately the distance between our head and our heart. Now, I know for some people that it's maybe 19 or 20 if you're really tall, and for some of the shorter variety it might only be about 13 or 14 or maybe even only a foot. I actually had the tape measure out, checking myself out yesterday. It's less than 18 inches for me. But let's say for the fun of it tonight, it's about 18 inches. The distance between our head and our heart. Now, this distance, this short distance between here and here is the most difficult journey that we're ever going to take. But it's also the most rewarding. When we're born, there's a conduit between our head and our heart, and feelings flow back and forth. The feelings that we feel in our heart, they're like a serve and return type of relationship. So we feel things in our heart that goes up to our brain to be processed, and then our brain tells us what we're going to do with it afterwards, and that continues on until something like this happens. Trauma. Now, when trauma happens, we get disconnected from our feelings. We go up to into our head as a means of surviving. Life ceases to be about wonderment and becomes a series of problems to be solved. So I put on this slide, when a child experiences trauma, life ceases to be about wonderment and becomes a series of problems to be solved. So many of you know that and understand that from your own experiences, but let me tell you how this can happen to people, and more particularly how it happened for me. So I grew up with an alcoholic father and a physically abusive mother. And so there was a fair bit of trauma in my household. There was lots of crazy stuff that went on, as happens in a lot of households. Mine isn't that unique. So what happened to me and why life ceased to be about wonderment and became a series of problems to be solved was I used to lay in bed at night and listen to my mother and father argue. And the most often I remembered them arguing about money. So there never seemed to be enough to go around, and I would lie in bed at night and listen to the arguments rage on, fueled by alcohol. And subconsciously, I started to think about how I could reduce my footprint in the family, how I could need less and take up less space and have less need for money, because mom and dad were struggling financially, it seemed to me. So I quit asking to go on school field trips. I was content to have the hand-me-downs from my brothers and things like that. I didn't ask for much. And that's the type of thing that can happen to us when we experience trauma. So as children, we start going into the problem-solving mode in terms of getting disconnected from our heart, and we go up here in terms of trying to survive and figure out what it's all about. Now, for many of you, it took way different forms. You might have grown up in extremely violent families. I'm happy to say mine wasn't physically violent, but I know many people grew up in a physically violent home. And if you witness that if you experience that violence as a child, you probably got disconnected from your feelings and found it very difficult to connect. I see heads nodding out there for sure. And then we wake up one day and we get introduced to a magic powder or magic elixir that tends to make things a little bit better, at least for a short time. And we start to medicate those feelings away a little bit. And when we drink and we use, we can forget about what's going on at home. But the difficulty with that is we get further disconnected from our feelings because we start medicating away any feelings that we might have had when we were growing up. Going up into our head is all about survival. And living in our hearts is about living. So it's a big difference. When we go up into our head and survive, we have difficulty connecting with, I think, all those important feelings that King Solomon was talking about when he wrote that proverb. We need to get back, we need to make that 18-inch journey from our head back down to our heart. Now here on this screen, you will see a list of 12 feelings. Now I boil it down or distill it down to 12 feelings to make it easy to remember. It's got no correlation between 12 steps and 12 feelings. And I often in our treatment room have people argue with me about, well, there's more feelings than that. I Googled it, and of course Google has got lots of input for us. And I came up with a list that's got 52 feelings, and people come in waving their list of 52 feelings or 72 or 82 feelings around. And this isn't about getting into debates about how many feelings there are or anything like that. This is about getting the list short enough that we can remember it. But we found every time that somebody comes in with one of those lists, we can usually get them into these 12 categories. So as an example, people will come and say, well, what about anxiety? It's not on the list. And I will say, well, anxiety is just a different word for fear. And people will say to me, well, okay, but what about frustration? It's not on the list either. And I will say, well, frustration is just a different word for anger. So I think if we work and jiggle things around, and I'm not here to say that anybody who's written those articles on Google aren't right, I think we can fit every human emotion into these 12 categories. So anybody who wants to debate this with me can come up and see me afterwards, and we can see if there's some that we can't fit in there. And I'm happy to add a 13th or 14th, but I do this just to make things a little bit easier. Now, when you look at that list, you see on the left-hand column, the one down at the bottom is joy. And I've put that in bold and underlined it. And when you look at this list of feelings, one might ask, why on earth would anybody want to feel those? Because the only one up there that looks like a positive feeling is joy. Who wants to feel fear and anger and pain, sadness and shame, all those negative emotions? But you know, I was working with Dr. Downing, and we were working on this list of feelings years ago, probably back, over a decade ago, probably about 12 years ago. And we started working on this stuff, and we started talking about there must be a reason, because God gave us these feelings. He's not an evil puppet master. He doesn't want to just see us twisting in the wind with shame and fear and pain and all those negative emotions. So we started thinking about it, and we realized that God's pretty smart. He creates the world with negatives. So we have equal parts of light and darkness, night and day. We have good and evil. We have negative and positive ions. We have negative and positive poles on a magnet, and so on and so forth. So why aren't feelings the same? We started to think maybe they were. So we believe that each one of these feelings, if you are willing to go into them, to embrace these feelings, or to allow the feelings to hold you, you'll get the gift that God intended you to get from these feelings. So I'm going to go through these. Let's start with fear. So that's one that many of us know. The big book talks about fear all the time. And we believe that the gift of fear is wisdom. So this one's a pretty easy one. So fear keeps us from stepping in front of the C train, because that's a battle that we're going to lose. So it's pretty easy to figure out that the gift of fear is wisdom. We're not going to do that. The gift of anger is strength. So not the type of strength that has us punching our fists through a wall or kicking a garbage can across the room or punching somebody in the nose, but a different type of strength where we have the strength to deal with things like our addiction, strength to get through a difficult day, strength to get through a difficult time in our life. And sometimes when we get angry about these things, like having an addiction or alcoholism or something else, we get the strength to power through. The gift of pain is growth. No pain, no gain. We often hear that. So when we find ourselves in painful situations, if we look to the positive side of that negative feeling, we find growth. The gift of sadness is healing. So we might say, who would want to be sad? Well, we all know that if we've lost a loved one, if we're going through a grief process, that as long as we allow ourselves to go through the grief process, we get healing that comes from that. So that's the gift of sadness, is healing. The gift of shame is humility. So this one is sometimes a little bit harder to wrap our heads around. So when we break out of shame and we start talking about our story, and for those of us that are in 12-step programs, we know this. The more we tell our story, the more shame releases its hold on us. So we break out of our shame by gaining some humility and saying things like, my name's Brad and I'm an alcoholic. The more I tell my story, the more pieces of that I'm able to come out with, and the more and more shame releases its hold on me. So the gift of shame is humility. The gift of joy, just like sadness, is healing. And that one makes sense too. When we have laughter and we're having a good time, there's a lot of healing that comes from that. Now the next one is hopelessness, or I put in brackets, powerlessness. So those of us who have struggled with addiction know the feeling of powerlessness. And we know that the answer, or the gift to powerlessness, is found on page 417 of the Big Book of Alcoholics. And the gift of powerlessness is acceptance. So when we finally admit that we're beat, that we're completely flat out and we need to reach out for help, when we accept that we have a problem, we start to get the healing gift that God intends from that feeling which we think is terrible, that feeling of powerlessness. The gift of guilt is forgiveness or atonement. So when we do something wrong, we know we have to make amends, and I'll say most often, maybe not most often, but certainly sometimes, when we go and make amends, we do get the gift of forgiveness. But even if we don't, we do get the gift of atonement that comes from that. Now this one is Shannon's personal favorite, the gift of loneliness. Many of us do not like to be alone, and loneliness is, we find, is a cousin to fear, because we're terrified to be alone. And lots of times we feel that we need to be around people all the time. And I was certainly one of those people, so I can relate to anybody who struggles to be alone. But in loneliness, and when we're alone, that's the only time that we have for true introspection, for looking deep inside ourselves and trying to find out who we really are. So I believe that this is one of the reasons why in the 12-step program they say if you're not in a committed long-term relationship in your first year, don't get in one. Because we need to spend the time alone so we figure out who we are, so that we're then prepared to give the next person that we're maybe hoping to spend our life with a better version of us. So I think it's important to spend that time with ourselves, even though we're terrified, as I was, and I've got the long history of broken relationships to prove this. When I finally said, you know what, I've seen the problem and he is me. And I had to really take a look at the fact that I was the common denominator in each one of my broken relationships. And I finally went, you know, I think I need to spend some time alone in order to be able to figure this out. The next one is resistance. And the gift of resistance is protection. Now, I don't mean the type of resistance that is, I'm not going to meetings, I don't care what anybody says. I don't mean the type of stubbornness that we sometimes find ourselves in when we're getting into 12-step programs and into recovery, when we're trying to find the easier, softer way. That's not the type of resistance that I'm talking about. I'm talking about a psychic resistance that won't let us go to the next level in our healing. And when we're working and doing counseling and therapy, we often come up against that, where something is just going to be so painful that nobody can push through. So when somebody says, like, I feel like I'm stuck, I say it's time to back off, because we're getting psychic resistance. So when you're feeling that, as you move through your program and you start to get roadblocked, it's okay to stay there for a little while. This next one is another favorite of mine, emptiness. And the gift of emptiness is that it's a precondition for a new creation. So if you imagine a bowl here in my hands, if it's full, there's no room in it for anything else. But if it's empty, it's waiting for something to be put into it. So unlike God, I am a little bit twisted. So sometimes when my clients come in and say, I'm feeling really empty today, I go, that's great. Because now we're starting to do some healing, because we're creating room, we're sweeping out the cobwebs, we're clearing out all the old stuff that's keeping you unhealthy, and creating a new space for healthy behaviors and healthy relationships. So I love it when people come in and say to me, I'm really feeling empty today. And the last one, I think, is a little bit misunderstood. If there's anything in a 12-step meeting that kind of gets me to cringe or have the hair stand up on the back of my neck, it's when people will say, you can't be on the pity pot. Well, I disagree with that. You can. You just can't stay there. See, there's been a lot of bad stuff that's happened to a lot of us along the way, and I think sometimes we need to experience a little bit of self-pity so that we learn to be gentle on ourselves, to grant ourselves the mercy that our Creator, our God, would grant us as well. So we have to be gentle at times. So I started out by saying that the more that you learn to feel, the more capacity your heart has for feeling. The bigger it's capable of getting, just like the Grinch that stole Christmas. And eventually, it just keeps swelling and swelling as we learn to make that 18-inch journey from our head to our heart. If anybody's struggling with making that journey, it's just a matter of sitting down someplace quiet, away from the noise, away from the clamor, a quiet room. And what I say to people, they say, how do I get in touch with my feelings? I say it's quite simple. You just sit down and you do this. You resist the urge to be busy. You resist the urge to turn on the iPad, the cell phone, the television. You resist the urge to pick up the phone and phone a friend and just sit there and ask yourself, what is it that I'm feeling? And the one thing I have to caution you with is you don't immediately get the gift of feeling. You have to sit there sometimes. Sometimes the gift comes somewhere down the road. But I guarantee you that if you'll practice this, if you'll practice just sitting in your feelings, you'll get these 12 gifts that come from these 12 feelings, these condensed 12 feelings that I've made into a short list so that everybody can remember them. So now you see why I don't think King Solomon was just talking about romance when he wrote, "Guard your heart above all else, for it determines the course of your life." That is what this journey is all about. It is about living instead of just surviving. And doing that determines the course of your life. Please join me.